So as we continue our section on managing credit, our entire unit, we're on Chapter 8 now, which is about credit records and laws. In this first section, we're going to talk about establishing credit. And there are three primary things that we're going to look at. So we're going to look at credit records and reports. Then we're going to look at credit worthiness. And then we're going to briefly talk about how you can get started using credit. So the first big point is regarding credit records. And the most important thing that you need to know here is that they are going to look at past credit performance. And they're looking at these kinds of questions. But they're trying to look at your history because your history is a strong indicator of what your current situation is as well as your future situation and whether you're worth the risk or not. So it is a complete record of your borrowing as well as your repayment performance. And this is what helps them determine whether or not they want to issue you credit. So everybody that uses credit has information on file with a credit bureau. And all a credit bureau is, it's a business that gathers, stores, and sells credit information about people, individuals to other businesses. And there are three major ones that you need to know. And you'll need to fill out a workbook page on this and go out and research phone numbers and addresses. But the three major bureaus are Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. So how does this process actually work is what the next slide is trying to talk about. So let's just use Target as an example. So credit bureaus gather information from a business such as Target, and Target is a subscriber. Target then pays a monthly fee to that credit bureau to access their information to determine whether or not they would want to issue you a credit card based on all your borrowing and repayment history. So they access it first to determine whether to issue a credit card. Then once they issue customers a credit card, they also then supply all this kind of information about your borrowing and repayment history with them to those credit bureaus so that those credit bureaus can keep updating all the historical data about you. And then they go out and find information from a lot of other places like public records and things too, which we will talk about in the future. Once they've done that and gathered all that information, the bureaus, they do a credit report. So it's just a written statement about how things are going. These credit reports can contain errors, so you ought to order a copy of your credit report and review it at least once a year. You can do that free once a year. And that website is www.annualcreditreport.com. So I'd highly recommend that's something you do every year for the rest of your life to make sure that there's no errors that are impacting your ability to get credit or obtain credit. And page 179 in the book has an example of one of these credit reports if you want to look at that as we talk through this slide. So what do we know about the credit reports? So they're used for these reasons, which you would expect. Anything that's bad that happens stays for 7 years, except for bankruptcy that stays on your record for 10 years. So it follows you around for a long time. The report formats vary, but they're very similar, and they contain typically these sections. So that first one is just a summary of information from the rest of the report. The public record information has things like lawsuits and judgments against you, marriage decrees, divorces, things like that. Credit information is going to have your credit card, department store, other loan information. Account details going to show monthly balances, use of credit limits, things like that. Request for credit history is going to include things like what employers or creditors or insurance companies were trying to find out about you. And then finally, the personal information has all the names you've ever used, your social security number, addresses, date of birth, phone number, license number, things things like that. So again, you can take a look at one of those on page 179 in the text. So again, how it's used, I've already indicated that before I would issue you credit, I'm going to try to find out about you and get a credit report. And here are some people that typically do it, and the reason they do it is because they want to make sure that you're financially responsible. And we talked really kind of about these types of things on the form itself. The only other thing then that I want to chat about real quick is the credit card services. You can typically, for a fee, it's rarely free. You can be notified if anyone's trying to access your credit file, so that you have an idea as if people are possibly trying to do identity theft or why they're doing it. And then you can also freeze your credit, which is what I personally have done because I did have my identification stolen. So I now have a credit freeze out there. So if anyone tries to access my credit report from those 3 national bureaus, they can't get it unless I unfreeze it. So they contact me and I either say yes or no and go in and unfreeze it for an hour so that it can be checked, and then I close it down again. So that takes care of the first big learning objective on credit reports and files and services. The second big thing is regarding credit worthiness, and before they will grant you credit, they're trying to determine that. And how they determine it, and this goes across the board in the world, there's 5 basic qualifications, and they're the 5 C's. So similar to the fact that you need to know that interest equals P times R times T, and you'll learn the rule of 72 for investing. This is one of those crucial things. The 5 C's of credit, everybody ought to know those and what they mean. So here are the 5 C's. They're character, capacity, capital conditions, and collateral. And we've talked about some of them, but I'll go through them again with a slide for each. So character is all about trying to figure out if you're responsible or not. And one of the biggest factors that they use when evaluating your responsibility and your character is stability. And good stability would be, I've had the same job for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. I don't have gaps in employment history, things like that. So I'm stable, I'm reliable. Capacity is, can you repay the debt? Can I pay this loan back? And if you read through this big bullet, the rule of thumb in general tells you that if payments on the credit card that you make every month is less than or equal to 20% of your take-home pay, your disposable income, then you probably have the capacity to repay a loan. Capital is the 3rd C, and we've talked about capital before. So it's the difference between your assets and your liabilities, what I own and what I owe. And when I add up all that, I should have enough left over to pay off my debt. Then the 4th C is conditions. And conditions are external factors. They're not things that you can personally control. They're things that are happening out in the economy. So they're looking at things that are happening with unemployment, maybe how secure is your job, the business in particular. Are you working for a big company that's been around forever, or is it a startup that may not weather a storm? And your particular area especially, in looking at conditions there. So this again is external, not part of what you can truly control. And then the final one is collateral, the final C. And we talked about collateral. So when I borrow money, it is what is pledged. It's the assets I pledge to repay that loan, so that if I'm unable to repay it, the lender will take those assets, sell them to repay it. So collateral, this is important, lowers their risk of lending to you, and it makes them more willing to lend to you. So that is your 5 C's. You have to know those things. And then the final thing in this section is how to get started with credit. And I'm going to put all of these up here, but I think it's important that you know that a lot of people's opinions on this vary, including mine. So it lists different things for you to do. I am not a believer in all these things. I think it's great to have a savings account. Sorry, that was the doorbell. So I do think opening a savings account is a good idea, and then a checking account to the extent that you're able to. Opening up store credit accounts or small loans or credit cards, to me, does not seem like a great way to get started on credit, taking out debt to show I can pay. Instead, it would be better just to pay your bills on time when you have them. So if I go to college and I'm in an apartment, to get the utilities in my name and pay those utilities on time and start to establish credit history like that. But again, opinions vary. These are some suggestions that the book gave you. So hopefully that helps kind of understanding all of our credit records and credit worthiness, the 5 C's, and how to get started.